Well, can I thank Ross for the introduction and also thank Katrina Jackson for inviting me to stand in a sense today on behalf of Kim Carr, who is our Shadow Minister for Science on the Labor side of things. But it is for me nice to be speaking in a little bit of a break from what I would normally talk about in terms of my own portfolio, but be speaking about something which for me is a real passion. As Ross mentioned, I am a science graduate, sadly one of the few who sit in Parliament, but one of the others is Karen Andrews, who you heard from before, and together she and I co-chair the Parliamentary Friends of Science, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But it is very much a passion of mine to be doing everything we can to try and promote science and its discussion within the public debate, and I think that is more important now than perhaps we've seen for many a time, indeed perhaps ever. Last week, in what was a exercise of bipartisanship within the Australian Parliament, we began the process by passing through the House of Representatives the enabling legislation for the China Free Trade Agreement. It was an important step down a path which is emblematic, I think, of the great opportunity that we have in this country going forward. And that is that we live in the East Asian time zone, where we are witnessing perhaps the most significant social phenomenon in the world today, and that is the rise of the Asian middle class. And we're seeing that particularly in China, but we're seeing it in India as well, in countries like Indonesia, throughout ASEAN. It is our great economic opportunity. And we have been engaging in that opportunity, I suppose, over many years now in terms of supplying resources. We will, I think, by virtue of the Free Trade Agreement, be in a much better position to pursue our agricultural opportunities. But in truth, if we are going to really take advantage of this, if we are going to surf this wave rather than be swamped by it, then we must make science and technology absolutely central to our economy. We simply have to become a science and technology-based economy. And there is not an open-ended window for us to do that. There is an urgency, I believe, for us to transition our economy so that we can become that and really be in the driver's seat, in the engine room of that great economic phenomenon that we are going to see play out in our time zone. We have many natural advantages, I think, which allow us to perform that role. I do think that our history as a pioneering culture within the New World has meant that ingenuity, I reckon, is innate to the Australian DNA. When Australians do science, we do it really well. And we've seen that, flourish in terms of penicillin. We've seen it more recently in terms of the CSIRO's work on Wi-Fi, the development of the black box. Indeed, in my hometown of Geelong, James Harrison, the great figure of Geelong's history, we credit as being the inventor of modern refrigeration. Throughout our history, we've been really good at science. And we have a fantastic education system which can be the platform for this. But our challenge is that our neighbours, I think, are catching up. And I actually don't think that historically we have celebrated science within our culture in the way that it is celebrated in other parts of the world. And certainly, if you think about our parliament, and this is very much a bipartisan statement I'm about to make, a sad one, I do think the science literacy of parliamentarians is nowhere near what it should be. And if Karen and I share a cause, it is that, to try and bring science as often as we can to the Parliament and to try and improve the level of science understanding and science debate within our Parliament, because it's absolutely fundamental if we are going to develop a sophisticated debate around science within our public affairs. But if you then say, what do we need to do to meet that challenge? For me, I think in a policy sense, there are three really important steps that we need to pursue. The first is, obviously, we have to, as a country, invest in science. I mean, science is not exclusively the domain of public resource. Science is pursued in the private sector all over the place. But in large measure, it is a public endeavour. A point I often make is that the laws of motion developed by Isaac Newton were done so on the public purse. Albeit in a Swiss patent office, the laws of relativity were developed under the public purse. It is really important through our universities, through our major research institutions like the CSIRO, that we are properly funding public research in this country so that we can do groundbreaking fundamental science. And to me, that is an important piece of infrastructure, if you like, as you will see anywhere else in the country. In government, Labor walked the walk. During our term of the Rudd-Gillard era, we saw a 50% increase in the funding of science, investment, research and innovation. We saw something like 190,000 extra student places be created during that period of time, and a 10% increase per student in the funding of those people. And we were on track over the decade 2007 through 2017, at the time that we left office, to see a doubling of our university funding. We have a very proud record on the Labor side in terms of walking the walk when it comes to that investment in science. The second thing we need to be doing is encouraging students to study science. And again, we've announced in our budget reply a number of measures which will seek to encourage people to do that. 25,000 teaching scholarships for those engaged in the STEM subjects. We've talked about and committed to providing coding as a key element of the curriculum from primary school onwards. And we're looking at helping 100,000 students going forward in terms of their HECS debt, those who are pursuing studies in the science areas. All important steps forward in terms of encouraging people to study and to pursue science. But I think there's another element here, and this, I guess, harks back to my own experience of pursuing science as a student, and that is that we do need to celebrate big science in this country. I think the kind of a critical moment for me is Year 10. That's the moment at which people are making their determinations about what academic discipline they're going to pursue. I was in Year 10 in 1982, and that is just about the peak of time when people were choosing to pursue science studies in this country at that age. And in some respects, I think, why was it a more natural path to walk then, perhaps compared to now? And for me, my inspiration, I feel in some respects like I'm a child of Apollo. The moon landings and everything that we saw about that space program was the most amazing and publicly explained scientific endeavour perhaps ever. I mean, this was front page news, but it was science. We're not seeing that today in anything like the same way, and for me it's a real bugbear. And yet big science is going on all around us. You look at the Square Kilometre Array telescope, you look at Australia's participation in the Giant Magellan telescope and which is one of the new generation of optical telescopes that are going to come online. You think about what those telescopes will enable. I remember being at a lecture about the Giant Magellan telescope, and the point was made that we have enough information now to identify planets out there which are likely candidates to have life on them. We understand biomarkers and how you can perceive those, and there is every likelihood that with the advent of the Square Kilometre Array telescope and the next generation of optical telescopes, that we will within our lifetime identify places elsewhere in the universe where life exists. We won't be able to talk to it, we won't know exactly what it is, but we will know that we are not alone. That is an enormously profound moment in the human story. Australia is right at the forefront of it, but where do you ever read that in our media? And if we want to inspire people to go and study science, they are stories which need to be told, and it is really important that we have our media telling them. But the third thing that we absolutely have to do, and we have not done well historically, and it's really, I think, at the core of this meeting today, is the engagement between public research and private enterprise. There are many indicators around this which show that Australia does lag behind other countries, and we need to be looking to the world and where best practice exists and doing our best to draw the experiences from that. I mean, US is right at the forefront of this. I sometimes think the lessons that we draw from the US are a bit hard to translate here, because when you're talking about an economy of 300 million people and the largest economy in the world, I think the rules are slightly different to one that applies to a population of 23 million people. But you look at a country like Israel, smaller than here, very entrepreneurial, an economy which is absolutely science and technology based, where the chief scientist is a driver of public policy in that country. We need to be learning those lessons, and we need to be taking those lessons and transforming ours into an economy which is science and technology based as well. We do have really good examples in Australia. I remember speaking to an Israeli representative in Australia who made the point that universities in Israel are hubs of innovation and enterprise. And he made a comment that he had not seen as much of that in Australia, although actually where we're standing here now is a good example of that. But Deakin University in my electorate, in my hometown, is a really fantastic example of this, where you look at the Geelong Technology Precinct, a company like Carbon Revolution making carbon fibre wheels for motor cars. All of that is driven by the best carbon fibre research furnace in the world. And that is a publicly funded endeavour, but Carbon Revolution is a private company based on the campus. And that's exactly the kind of model that we need to see happening all over the country. Under the leadership of Kim Carr, our Shadow Minister for Science, Jason Clare, our Shadow Minister for Communications, and others, our Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen, Ed Husick, we've been developing innovation and science policies as well, such as the creation of a $500 million smart investment fund, which looks to try and get more easily flowed venture capital into this space to encourage startups. Working with the finance sector to do that, and putting in place innovation investment partnerships, which is really about bringing together venture capital, superannuation funds and the startup community to work out ways in which we can have a much better transition, or a much better flow of money for startups, and have much more seamless transitions from public research into private commercialisation. We have to get that answer right. And I guess that's the point at which I want to end. It's not that this is something which is important for us to do going forward. It is that, in my view, this is the defining challenge of Australia's contemporary economy. Like, this is what we must solve. This has to be as integral going forward as opening our economy up was back in the 1980s. If we can get this right, then there is the wave of the East Asian economy that we can surf, and we will be as prosperous a society as there is on the planet. But as I said at the outset, there's not an open-ended time to this. Our neighbours are catching up, and it's absolutely critical that we get this right now. Thank you for having me. Do you want to take this? So I think I'm here to take some questions if anyone has.
You mentioned the media. I think that's really interesting. Those of us who are old enough remember Julius Sondevilla Saturday morning.
Me too.
That show doesn't exist anymore. Why don't we come up with a proposal to all Australian newspapers that in return for the ability to sell your stuff, you have 1 page a week devoted to something scientific, explaining it for, quotes, the common man, to increase scientific literacy in our nation, beyond all topics scientific, and just have 1 page where we talk about something scientific.
Well, look, it's obviously always a dangerous thing to go and be prescriptive about what the media should write about. But having said that, I'm up for anything. I'm up for anything, and I just think it is important to get the editors of our major newspapers around a science table and say that this is a critical thing that should be discussed. I mean, it is a part of the public space in the US and in a country like Israel in a way that it just isn't here. And if you want to make politicians engage and see that this is something that is important to get right, you have to put it in the public domain. And I do think that it isn't enough for the media to say that they simply report what's out there. The media does have obligations here, and I think it is really important for the scientific community to engage in quite an assertive way with those who run our media spaces about exactly this question. So, and maybe that's an idea that should be floated with them.
Sorry, Amanda Corbell from the National Youth Science Forum. With respect, no one's really reading the newspapers for that kind of content these days. If we're talking about communicating with younger people, there's a stack of stuff out there already. The Veritasium video channel on YouTube, ASAP Science, there's lots of content out there. In terms of wider public discourse, of course, our media providers need to be involved in that discussion. But if we're trying to convert those Year 8, Year 9, Year 10 young people, there's lots of content out there.
Look, I don't disagree with that, and there are wonderful models of science communication that we have in Australia. I think Questacon, for example, as sort of public or science outreach education entity, is probably world's best practice. So it's not like we're completely hopeless at all this stuff. But I guess the point I'm really trying to make is this. When you have the President of the United States stand up and say that it is going to be a national endeavour to put a man on the moon, and that then becomes front page news, not sort of in a niche, but actually something that everyone is digesting, such that the person who, I guess, is the embodiment of the moment, Neil Armstrong, maybe is the most famous person of the 20th century. Like that's the background that informed my decisions when I'm thinking about whether to pursue science or not. And it just seemed to me to be the most exciting. I mean, the pursuit of science, the pursuit of knowledge, the answering of unanswered questions just seemed to me to be the pinnacle of human endeavour. Like that's where it was. That's the place to be at. That's when you're going to make a decision to pursue it. I just don't think that's what we're talking about now. And yet, and if it were the case that science is kind of dead out there and we're not doing anything, well, that might be the answer. It's just that it's not. You know, when I had the experience of being the Parliamentary Secretary for Innovation in Industry, and as I said to a number of people, I was then Kim Carr's Parliamentary Secretary, I sort of saw myself as Australia's chief science tourist. And was going all over the country looking at fantastic things. We're doing amazing things in this country, but who knows? Who knows? Like the Square Kilometre Array, everyone should know about it, and yet, it is. I mean, it's as big a scientific project on the planet today, and it's happening here. Well, and other places, but a key part of it's happening here. Why doesn't everyone know about it? Why doesn't the Australian report it? Not sort of buried in the middle of the paper, or for that matter, actually, the Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun. Why isn't it in the first few pages? Because landing on the moon was, and that's it. Somehow we've got to get those newspapers engaged in the modern scientific quests that we're all about.